Trees. At BYU, the current direction we've received is to have shrub crews prune the tree branches they can reach from the ground with a pole saw. Like we talked about in the general segment of our training video, one of our goals is to preserve the natural characteristics of the plant. Preserving the natural characteristics of a plant is accomplished by making a series of appropriate cuts. An appropriate cut is a cut that is made in the proper place, at the proper angle, and is clean. In order to make a cut in the proper place and at the proper angle, we need to take note of a couple of things. We need to be able to locate the branch collar and the branch bark ridge. The branch collar is a swollen area that encircles or nearly encircles the branch at its base. The branch bark ridge is a strip of raised bark where overlapping fibers meet at the base of the branch just beyond the branch collar. We also need to pay attention to the lateral branch, the parent stem involved, and the angle at which the lateral branch and the parent stem intersect. Proper place. A proper cut is a cut that is generally made as close as possible to the outside of the branch collar without going through it. Proper angle. A proper cut is a cut that is perpendicular to the growth axis at the point of attachment. There are four main kinds of cuts: 2 kinds of thinning cuts and 2 kinds of heading cuts. At BYU, making heading cuts on trees is rare and only happens in extenuating circumstances. That said, and for the purposes of this training segment, we're going to limit our discussion to thinning cuts. A thinning cut is a cut that removes an entire stem at its base or a lateral branch at its point of origin. There are 2 kinds of thinning cuts: removal cuts and reduction cuts. Thinning cut number 1, removal cuts. A removal cut is a cut that removes an entire stem at its base. To make a removal cut, we remove stems back to parent stems. A parent stem is the larger, thicker stem from which the smaller, thinner lateral originates. That said, and depending on the plant, we may have a number of different options when it comes to making removal cuts, any of which would be considered appropriate. So, for instance, with this particular plant, we could make a removal cut here and remove this smaller lateral branch because it branches off of this larger parent stem. We could make a removal cut here and remove this smaller lateral branch because it branches off of this larger parent stem. Or we could make a removal cut here and remove this smaller lateral branch because it branches off of this larger parent stem. And again, all of these cuts would be considered appropriate, and all of these cuts would be considered removal cuts because we're cutting back to a parent stem. Thinning cut number 2, reduction cuts. A reduction cut is a cut that removes a larger, thicker stem back to a smaller, thinner lateral branch. At BYU, for structural and health reasons, we try to prune back to parent stems or strong lateral branches. A strong lateral branch is a branch that is at least 1/3 the diameter of the parent stem. That said, depending on the plant and similar to what we talked about with making removal cuts, we may have a number of different reduction cut options, several of which would be considered appropriate. So for instance, with this particular plant, we could make a reduction cut here and remove this larger stem back to a smaller lateral branch. We could make a reduction cut here and remove this larger stem back to a smaller lateral branch. Or we could make a reduction cut here and remove this larger stem back to a smaller lateral branch. And again, all of these cuts would be considered appropriate, and all of these cuts would be considered reduction cuts because we're cutting back to a strong lateral branch. In any case, and regardless of the location of the cut, reduction cuts are made by cutting larger stems back to strong laterals just beyond the point of attachment. The 3-cut method. When a tree branch is too heavy to support with one arm, we suggest removing the branch using the 3-cut method. To remove a branch using this method, we first begin by making an upward cut about 12 inches from the trunk or parent stem and cut about 1/4 of the way through the branch. This upward cut helps prevent the bark from tearing into the trunk or parent stem as the heavier part of the branch is removed. Then from that point, we'll move an additional few inches away from the trunk or parent stem and make a downward cut all the way through the branch in order to remove the heaviest part of the branch. Our third and final cut is generally made as close as possible to the outside of the branch collar without going through it. This is the end of the tree pruning segment of our training video. We realize that when it comes to pruning trees, there's a lot of room for personal preference, and we realize that this training is not a complete tree pruning training. But we hope that this training will give you a better idea of how shrub crews help prune trees at BYU.